Hello and welcome. I'm Jacob Levitin, Program Coordinator of the Institute for Humanities Research, and I'll be serving as moderator and interlocutor for today's event, Academic Journals Publishing Tips and Tricks. To see our upcoming programming, you can register for today. Please visit the IHR's website at ihr.asu.edu. The format of today's conversation will include questions and conversation before we open up things for Q&A. And in that regard, you'll be able to access both the Q&A function and the chat of today's Zoom webinar. And I'm glad to introduce today's speaker. Nicole Anderson is Director of the Institute for Humanities Research, Professor of English at Arizona State University, and Editor-in-Chief of Derrida Today, the leading-edge journal taking the French philosopher Jacques Derrida's work as a point of departure for explorations in deconstruction and continental philosophy. Since Anderson's founding of the journal nearly a decade and a half ago, under her editorship, Derrida Today has comprised a critical voice of the vanguard of the theoretical humanities, critically attuned to the needs of philosophy now. Anderson's research and editorial work are capacious. Her publications have cross-connected and critically contributed to various interdisciplinary terrains across the humanities and cross-disciplinary spaces at the interstices of where the humanities meet science. Fields she's expert in include animal studies, ethics, cultural studies, biopolitics, post-structuralism, and post-humanism, a range exemplified by the decisive intervention of her 2012 book, Derrida Ethics Under Erasure, which explored the many ways in which the philosopher engaged rigorously with questions of ethics, a modality so often denied Derrida by his critics. Anderson's work has appeared in, among other venues, the Oxford Literary Review, Philosophy Today, the Southern Journal of Philosophy, Social Semiotics, Parallax, Film Quarterly, and Cultural Studies Review, as well as manifold edited collections, including the Edinburgh Companion to Animal Studies. And drawing directly upon this constellation of thought under Anderson's editorial program, Derrida Today has addressed the many implications of Derridian deconstruction for grappling with the world in all its problems and possibilities, culminating in special issues on science studies, democracy, pandemic, and protest, and most recently on the long neglected ways in which Derrida's work was intertwined with that of his fellow 68er and Parisian radical Louis Althusser. But perhaps more than anything, and very much in the spirit of today's conversation, Professor Anderson is known for her generous mentorship of early career academics. So with that, I thought we would just take the plunge directly into the questions that'll catalyze today's conversation.
Thank you, Jake. Just before you do plunge in, I think, do we now have time to actually run the Zoom? That was very generous of you. Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. It's very, very nice of you. And yeah, so let's start with the first question.
All right, fabulous. So yeah, sort of to begin at the beginning, just how does one select a journal to publish in? And I'm thinking especially about journal websites and how one might get clued in to the journals one might submit one's work for relative to scope and aim and things like that, information for prospective authors. So yeah, where does one start with trying to figure out where to publish?
Well, one starts with your field of research for a start. So there's a number of things that when I was an early career academic and just starting out, one of the things I really wanted to do was publish a lot. And so I was in cultural studies. And so I looked at the presses that publish cultural studies journals. And I looked at those journals and I made sure that when I looked at them, I read who the editorial board was and whether it was reviewed. Right, that's really important. If a journal's not reviewed, do not publish in it, because that will come up in your promotions application. It will also come up in your, if you're trying for job applications. It's something that a panel will look very closely at. So a reviewed journal is a sign of status and prestige and academic rigor. So whatever's published in that journal is actually peer reviewed, right, by the best in your field. So you need to look at if a journal is reviewed and what the review process is. I'd also look at the editorial board. make sure that the editorial board has got big names in your field, one or two at least, because that again, that shows the prestige of the journal, and the editorial board is actually, it works as the editor uses the editorial board to actually send out reviews to. So that's really important. So those big names will be reviewing papers for the journal. And that shouldn't be intimidating whatsoever, because generally speaking, those people who are well established in their careers are very generous and want to see the field succeed. Okay, they do not want to gatekeep it. You know, they want to be able to contribute to strengthening the field. And so if you ever get a review back from an editor, see it as a gift, see it as somebody trying to help you create a stronger article, and you're getting free peer review, right? And that's a really great thing to have. So the other thing to, when you're selecting a journal to publish in, I also make sure it's published by a reputable press. There are some presses that, you know, are more vanity presses, and that's not so good. They're not peer reviewed, and basically any man, woman, person can publish in it, and it doesn't off the street, basically. So just be careful of those kind of publishers. So when you're selecting a journal, make the way to do that is it's published by a good press. It's got a peer review process in place. It's got a really good editorial board. And it doesn't necessarily have to be around for a long time, as long as it's got those three factors. It's really important. The other thing is the aims and scope, as Jake mentioned before, is really important. I mean, you can do a scattergun effect and you can send, this is what happens in Derrida today. I get a lot of people sending me their articles that have nothing to do with Derrida or deconstruction, right? And do not do that. It's a waste of time. It's not going to be published if it doesn't meet the scope and the aims of the journal. So you can just find that out by going to their website, the journal website, and find out, well, what is it that they're focusing on? So, for example, Derrida today focuses on, clearly, French philosopher Jacques Derrida, his work, but also more broadly deconstruction, the whole notion and concept of deconstruction. So there's kind of two ways in which, and the journal will go. It will be very detailed work around a piece of Derrida's work of some sort, an analysis of Derrida's work, a new insight around that work, or it will look at articles that are around deconstructing, using Derrida's work to deconstruct something else, like a cultural event or phenomena of some sort, but it is definitely deconstructive. So there's kind of the more finer, detailed stuff around Derrida's work, or deconstruction more broadly, and it's very interdisciplinary. So, and what that means is you can use a whole range of different methods and theories, or come from a different particular discipline to think about Derrida's work. So that's kind of a broad aim and scope of Derrida today, and other journals are very different, right? And so you need to take that into account, because if you're not meeting that, then you will not even get it sent out for review. Hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that's fabulous, I think, as a point of departure. And could I pick up on one thread to ask you about as sort of a follow-up? And I'm thinking especially about the graduate students in the audience who perhaps haven't submitted to a journal yet. Could you describe a bit about the process of what you do as an editor when you send a prospective piece out for review? What that looks like, what it means when an author gets comments back, things like that.
Okay, so papers are either unsolicited or they're invited, right? So if it's an unsolicited paper or article that you send to a journal, what I do as an editor is I read through that article first. I read it and I make sure that it's meeting the scope and the aims, that it's actually written, that it's applied style guide, which you can find online in any journal. A publisher, press will have the style guide, and that it's written clearly and has a good, strong argument. If it's got those basic things to start with, then that's step one. Then it gets sent to two reviewers, right? Blind peer review. So the reviewer doesn't know who the author is. When you submit an article, you need to make sure that you take off all the factors that might point to you as an author, including citing yourself, right? So take that off. And then that gets sent to two reviewers. The review process is a bit torturous sometimes because reviewers, along with editors, are doing this kind of work voluntarily. Now, it's part of academic service, but it takes a lot of time. And reviewers get asked, not just from you, but from a whole range of different people to review articles. So sometimes it can take 2 to 3 months to get something reviewed because it has to fit into people's timelines, right? And they have other deadlines and they're publishing and they've got teaching and they've got, other service roles and things like that. Once it's reviewed, it comes back with either yes, publish straight away, or publish with minor edits, or publish with major edits, or publish with revise and resubmit. And then, of course, there's reject. Now, if you get anything above reject, that's great. If you've got revise and resubmit, as I said before, which is what Jacob was picking up on, then you can rework the article, right? And remember that there's a word count for journal articles. So you can't just be additive. You can't just go, oh, the reviewer wants me to talk about this or that, or thinks I need to do that. Just don't add it, because then it takes you over the word limit. And journals often have word limits because the press may, for example, only have 60,000 words that they can dedicate to a journal, because there's a cost effect to that. It costs the press to publish, all right? So if you go over that, then often that falls on the editor to have to pay up, right, the excess. So that's why keeping to word length is really, really important, right? And to go over that is a disregard for the whole publishing process and is kind of disrespectful, right? So when you ask to be revise and resubmit, don't just be additive. Actually just look at the whole paper again and think about, well, how do I need to include these in my arguments without going over the word limit? Once you've got the revise and resubmit done, then it goes back to either the same reviewer or to somebody else. Again, that can take another couple of months, right? Depending on how busy people are. So all up, it can take about 6 months, the whole process as a result. Journals are often, depending on the journal, will depend on how quickly an article will come out. So if a journal's only publishing 2 issues a year, then it's most likely it'll be a couple of years before you're published. If it publishes 4 issues a year, then that's going to be a little quicker. So you need to take that into account as well. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's brilliant and so helpful for sort of demystifying the whole ecosystem of one's first submission. So yeah, fabulous. And then just as one sort of follow-up question for early career researchers rather. I mean, and this is sort of a novice base level question as well. But let's say I have a piece, how many journals can I submit it to simultaneously?
Generally none.
Yeah.
So your article is an original piece of work, right? And most presses, I think most of them, right, do not want, they want to be the first to be able to publish it if it's publishable. Also, if you send it off to a number of journals, they're going to the trouble then sending it out to review. What happens then if you get 2 journals coming back and going, oh, the reviewer says, yes, publish, right? You have to choose. And the other journal is most likely to find out that, in fact, you've done, you've put them to the trouble of actually using up their reviewers, which are rare, They're like, you know, hen's teeth. They're very rare. And going to all that effort and trouble. And that's not a good, it's unethical. It's unethical to the editor, to the reviewers, to the whole process. And you won't get a good reputation because it will get around. There was one person in who submitted an article to Derrida Today, and next thing an editor about a few weeks later emailed me saying, do you know this person? Because they've actually sent their manuscript to me, or their journal article to me. This is another journal editor. And so we both discovered, right? I don't know how it was discovered, but it does get discovered, right? That editor banned that person from ever publishing in their journal again. I didn't do that. But, you know, because it was an innocent mistake in many ways. But the other journal editor had gone to so much trouble that they were just very, very annoyed. So I think you just need to, it's just like sending out, it's the same thing with books. You know, you don't send out your book proposal to several presses at once. You know, it's a big no-no.
Yeah. So this is, you know, another good impetus, right, for thinking really intentionally about where you're submitting, reading really carefully through the scope and aims of the journal, and making sure that one's work is in alignment with, the journal which one wants to publish in.
Exactly. And look, it's not to say that some journals won't accept, you know, your article being submitted to other journals at the same time. There's some that do, but most of the time, no. Yeah.
I see. All right. So the ethics, etiquette, and care for the process and distribution of labor that goes into the system is really important. Yeah. So yeah, one last question on the point of etiquette. So let's say I have a piece that I'm interested in publishing in, say, Derrida Today. Is it appropriate for a prospective author to reach out to an editor of a journal in advance of submission? Yeah, look, that depends. I mean, I would recommend, editors are busy. They're not just editors, they're also teaching, they're also doing their own research, they've also got their own service roles at the universities. You know, they're busy. This is a voluntary role that is not paid and gets very little institutional support most of the time, right? So there's no money for assistance to help. There's nothing. So it really comes down to the editor. Presses are pretty poor, allegedly, but they don't give that money to the journals, right? So you know, they don't provide you with assistance and stuff like that. So it really falls on the editor's shoulders. So unless it's a question that can't be answered by looking at the website and looking at the aims and scopes, how many times a year it's published, the style guide, you know, what you need to do, those kind of things, which are generally all on a website. You know, I'd be select about what you're actually emailing the editor for. So things you could email the editor for would be not how many times a year do you publish, but look, I think I understand the aims and the scope. This is the idea I have, and this is my abstract. You know, would this be something the journal might be interested in? And that would be fine. Yeah. So long as you've done your background research first. I see. All right, that's brilliantly insightful. Thank you. And then, yeah, I'm interested in hearing perhaps a bit more about how editorial boards are organized and what bearing that has on the process. It has a huge bearing in terms of journal rankings in the long run, like the prestige of the journal. Most boards will have people who are well known in the field and can contribute their years and years of expertise to the journal. So the editorial board has a number of functions. First, it reviews papers for the journal, but it also advises.
as well around, you know, separate issues, or people on the editorial board might put together special issues around particular topics that are really relevant or contemporary to the field. And also, the bigger the name on the editorial board, the more prestigious the journal, right? So, and that's kind of what you want to publish in. You want to publish, and that means that those people are reading your work, right? So that's a great thing, right? So there's this kind of networking effect too that comes out of that.
I see. So it's all about not being intimidated, sort of figuring out who your interlocutors are in terms of who you're reading and who you want to see read your work, and then allowing that to sort of take hold through the process of publishing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think such an empowering point for the early career researchers.
Yeah, but please don't be intimidated by it. It's a good thing, you know. So
yeah, right on. And then I wanna take perhaps a deeper dive into the question of style, right? Because every journal seems to sort of have its own sort of bent to different styles of writing. And this style of writing in general across all journals seems really different in terms of voice from, say, a dissertation or thesis chapter, even an essay for like an edited volume. These things can differ. So yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts as an editor on writing style in general.
I actually think that, well, leaving aside the dissertation for a moment, I actually think that you need to have your own voice. So it doesn't matter whether it's a book chapter or a journal article, finding your voice is the most important thing. You know, it's not like I don't change styles depending on the journal or a chapter. You know, I'm writing, I have a point I want to make. I have an argument I want to convey, and I have my voice in doing that. And I think that that's the most important thing. So in terms of writing style, that's up to the author. That's for you to find out what is your style, your voice, you know, and it doesn't matter whether that comes across as a book chapter or a journal article. In terms of dissertation, I mean, I can tell straight away if an article is just a chapter from somebody's dissertation. And the reason I can tell is I think for a journal article, you have to be original and you have to present your argument really well. It has to be rigorous with appropriate theoretical, I guess, or scientific evidence or discussion. And yes, you have to do that with a thesis, but with a thesis, you have to demonstrate wide knowledge of a field and you have to go down the rabbit hole of presenting that evidence. You don't have time to do that for a journal. So you have to make sure that the theoretical evidence you use is appropriate for the argument and still engages your reader without taking them down too much into a rabbit hole, right? So broad brushstrokes paint a picture of your argument that is compelling for journals, right? Or book chapters. And you're proving a point, but you're proving it through more, in some sense, for say Derrida today, you would assume that your reader would have knowledge of Derrida today. You don't need to do a literature review within your paper, right? So that's the difference. You're assuming that knowledge already exists by your readership because they're Derrida scholars.
I see. Yeah, that's so helpful, and yeah, also empowering, right? That one's voice in a journal article sort of occupies the foreground of things, and you can sort of let the sort of strictures of citational index and things like that sort of fall away from a thesis, whereby you're sort of trying to prove your knowledge. And it's not that a journal article doesn't prove your knowledge all throughout, but it's that the citational index is really advancing the compelling argument that the
well, you
don't
need, yeah, well, you don't need to, as I said, you don't need to do a literature review for a journal article or book chapter. You don't need to prove that you know the stuff. You're making the argument about something, right? And the theoretical evidence will come in and underpin that, right? So, yeah.
Fabulous. Yeah. And then, yeah, for graduate students, if they're thinking about going into a tenure track position after graduating, presumably they'll want to publish some of the dissertation in peer-reviewed journals. How many, or how, if you could sort of think through how much of a dissertation or thesis you would want to place in a journal as an aggregate. Do you have advice sort of in that regard?
Look, I am going to, after this, refer to Ron Berlio, who I think is on here, because in Australia and the UK, right, it may be different to the US. But this is what I understand from at least the Australian and the UK position, and that is that in fact, in Australia, you have dissertation by publication. So, but leaving that aside, if you're writing a thesis, 10% only should be publishable as your thesis, because you want the original knowledge that hasn't been published yet, right? So you could publish maybe 2 chapters out of your thesis, so long as it's not more than 10%. And I mean, I did that with my thesis a long time ago. So I actually published 2 chapters. In some sense, that kind of influences in a positive light that your work is already at the standard, right? For a thesis being accepted, right? We're gonna come back to Ron Berlio maybe if he wants to later and talk about what that might look like in the US context. In terms of yeah, so I think the rule of thumb is about 10%, and it's the same with when you're publishing journals or book chapters. You know, you may want to refer to your work, right, that you've published elsewhere. It should never be more than 10% of what you've published elsewhere within that journal article. You need to have an original argument, because that's what journals are there for. They want original work. They don't want work that is already out there.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's phenomenally helpful, I think. And then, yeah, the sort of flip side of that question, and this will be the last one of the sort of formal portion of today's program before we take the plunge into the open Q&A for you all. But I wanted to ask the sort of flip side question that would be geared towards assistant professors. And, you know, we touched upon this a little bit in terms of distribution of timeline for how long it takes for an article to be published once it sort of enters the journal pipeline. And so, yeah, so my question is, how many articles should one have in the pipeline once one begins a tenure track position, given these often protracted timelines to publish?
Well, I mean, it's precisely because of these protracted timelines in journal publishing that I've always, and I'm not going to give advice on this, but I'll tell you what I do. I've always had 2 or 3 on the go, right? So articles on the go. So as I've submitted one, I've already halfway through another, and then I submit that. So because it can take 2 to 3 years for an article to be published and in a journal, right? So that being the case, if you're going for promotion, or if you're going for tenure, or if you're even applying for a job, you want to be able to have things coming out in quick succession, right? So if you're sending one off and then another original article off somewhere else at the same time, then one might be published one year and one might be published next year. So all of a sudden each year you've got things coming out, right? Every year. And then you get momentum, right? So once you've got that momentum, that looks really fantastic on your CV. And it also alleviates that problem of, you know, waiting for something to come out, right? So sending off 3 separate, very different articles to different journal articles at the same time is kind of what I do in order to have that succession of stuff coming out every single year. That's really hard to do, I know, if you're starting out in a career and you're teaching a lot, that makes it harder, but it's probably why it's even more important to make sure that that's happening, right? Because teaching and service and all sorts of things in an academic career can get in the way. So it's kind of like an insurance policy in some ways. So if something happens and you've got a huge teaching load, at least you've got 3 articles out there already, you know. So if you can't write anything for a semester, you know, you've got stuff already on the boil and ready to go, kind of thing.
Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, we have to be holding space for ourselves to keep getting work out into the world. And yeah, that structure of three at a time, I think makes all the sense in the world.
Well, it is hard, but once you've done it, you know, then you've got a momentum, you know, and it means you can probably ease off a little bit at times, you know, because you've already got stuff coming out. I do acknowledge it's really difficult for that to happen, you know, sometimes, but if you can get that going, it will pay off.
Wonderful. Yeah, as always, feel free to be in touch with the IHR about ways that we can support you in this regard. So
I think we have questions.
We do indeed. So yeah, the first question is from David Reed, and I'll just read it aloud for you in the audience. And it is, how do you recruit peer reviewers? And how do you decide whether a potential reviewer is qualified?
So for me, I have a quite a large and distinguished editorial board on Derrida today. I do fall back on them a lot. I know I also have a whole list of very experienced people who are willing to review, and they're tenured, they're professors, they've been in the field for quite a while, and so I have a long list of those people. I know what their particular interest in their field is. So if a paper comes in on, say, I don't know, Derrida and Marx, for instance, I will send it to somebody who's got expertise in that field. I always make sure that the person has got expertise, well, regardless, they're going to have expertise on Derrida's work, right? But what they're actually interested in is also really important. And so that they can appropriately and adequately review the article to hand. So I only use a reviewer, like one of those reviewers, once a year, because people are so busy. Maybe sometimes even once every 2 years. So that's why having a large editorial board, but also outside of the editorial board, a whole range of people who want to be able to review for Derrida Today is really important. And I think that's the case with a lot of journal editors I know.
Right. Very good. Well, I hope that answers your question, David.
David, did it answer your question?
Well, feel free to post a follow-up. That goes for David and everyone. And then Nicole, you might want to riff on Ron's response to the advice about how much of the dissertation to publish. Ron says that the advice of 2 chapters of the dissertation for journal publication is right. It shows book publishers there's interest in the material, but not too much in print, such that the whole book manuscript is already in print and articles. And then it's good. And then Ron writes, in a revise and resubmit, and it's a question. In a revise and resubmit situation, what if I, as an author, agree with some of the reviewer's suggestions, but disagree with the reviewer about other aspects of the essay? Can I discuss this with the journal editor before revising?
Yes, Ron, you can. You can discuss it with the journal editor. And depending on how much you want to reject the reviewer's comments and how many you want to keep will depend on whether the editor will then send it for re-review to somebody else, right? I think it's always really important to remember that your article's been sent to the best in the field, right? The people who know what they're talking about. And that's not to say that the author doesn't at all. But there can be negotiation as a result, and that's absolutely no problem. But it probably will then be sent to another reviewer, a separate one.
I see. Yeah, that's a really, really important question. Let's see. And David, thanks you for answering that question. And yeah, we have plenty of time and space for additional questions. I have a million as per usual, but I want to give plenty of time and space to you all first.
Well, why don't you ask one, Jake, and others can think about stuff.
All right, sounds good. So yeah, I mean, I'm just so interested in the process of all this. And yeah, I'm interested in learning a little bit about how, in an ideal sort of trajectory, how it works in terms of an article has been submitted. Let's say you've decided it's right for Derrida today. You've sent it to a reviewer, and the reviewer agrees. But there are, a number of issues in the argument that should be worked out, and there's good advice. How would someone sort of think through the timeline and process of instantiating those revisions? Because I can imagine it intersects with sort of deadlines the journal has with Edinburgh University Press, for instance, things like that.
I always think, I think the onus is on the author when they want to get that back, right? So the quicker that can be turned around, then obviously the quicker it's going to be published. Usually the journal is booked out for 2 years, but I always keep space for an extra journal like article within the journal, just in case, I can turn around something pretty quickly if I need to. So there's always generally space within that 2-year time frame, but the quicker that those get done, the more likely you'll get published sooner. And that's really important if you're wanting to go for promotion or tenure and stuff like that. Again, which is why you should have 2 or 3 on the go, right? Because if, say, for example, Derrida Today couldn't publish it for 2 years, then at least maybe another journal might be able to publish it quicker. Not that article, but something else you're doing, so yeah. Yeah,
no, that's very helpful. And yeah, well, we continue to give space for people to type out their questions either in the chat or the Q&A. I'm interested in the special issue side of things. Can you give us a sense of what you look for, at least in Derrida today, for special issues and what they accomplish in perhaps comparison to sort of a traditional journal publishing format?
I don't know. Is there a traditional journal publishing format? I mean, that Derrida is not traditional. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
No, so Derrida Today is just like any other journal, right? So I have a bunch of associate editors, and I also have the editorial board. And part of their role too is to put forward special issues. So long as those special issues are things that are that meet the scope and the aims of the journal and are really kind of contemporary. What's happening now in the field? So, for example, a lot of stuff around biodeconstruction or eco-deconstruction is happening in the field, right? A real pushback against critiques that Derrida is not materialist enough and stuff like that. So there's a whole range of really cutting edge stuff that's out there. And so the special issues often focus on that, or they focus on, if not that, then something that is well known, like Althusser and Derrida's relationship or whatever it was, and the way their works intersected, from a new angle, from an angle that hasn't been done before. So whatever the issue is about, it has to be original, but and generally also it has to be really contemporary, what's happening now. Yeah,
that's tremendously helpful. And then we have a question from Ron, and it may be an impossible question to answer, which I think makes it a good one. And Ron writes, one of the anxieties of young scholars is the tenure clock or being on the market. It takes a while for a journal to publish an article. How does one reconcile the time of publication and the time of tenure or the job market?
I reckon that is an impossible question. Again, look, what I've advised my PhD students in the past to do is to start writing articles while they're actually writing their thesis. So taking, say, a little bit of their thesis, so that it's, and taking it off somewhere in a different direction so that it's not replicating the thesis, and that's something new, and starting straight away, as soon as they come into thesis program or master's program, start working on publications and working with your PhD supervisor to read through those copies and to make sure that they're okay and get them sent out. That's a way of alleviating anxiety, I think, in the sense of being ready to go on the job market. At least you've got a swag. Sorry, that's a very Australian term. At least you have a whole bunch of potential publications actually in the pipeline or already published by the time you're on the job market. So I mean, that's I guess one way of alleviating some anxiety about job market. But Ron, I'm not sure that answers your question.
Yeah, but it's such a luminous perspective, I think, because so often, emerging scholars can be told, to just focus on the dissertation or just focus on the book, and everything else is a waste of time. It just seems like that's not the case. Anything that gets your voice out there, that allows you to develop your voice, your arguments, the vectors of your argument that can be reaching in new directions beyond the dissertation or the book. I mean, it sounds all good.
Well, look, that's how I've always engaged with my PhD students. I've also really encouraged them to go to conferences straight away. As soon as they start, right, go and present, part of their chapter of their thesis at a conference. They're getting peer review feedback, right? They're getting feedback from the best people in the field, from their peers. And so that's going to help strengthen it. But then they can use that as well to make networks and to talk to people about jobs and to think about, well, getting your voice out there, but also getting yourself out there so people know you and they know the quality of your work is really important.
Yeah, it's critical.
I think it's critical.
I'm very much in agreement. And then I have a logistical question for those of us who work in visual culture or material culture studies or things like that. When we have objects in our articles that are just not our own words, but perhaps images and media, how does that affect the publishing process?
It doesn't really, except that it might take up page count. I mean, I think in Derrida today, we publish images. So what you need to do is you need to get the copyright cleared. So that's the onus of the author, right? So you need to get that cleared so that the press can then publish it. And then the press would also send you, and this is actually something you could probably ask the editor, right? Before you submit a journal, what JPEG format, like what are the pixels, what should the image and the size of the image be, and things like that, so that you get that right when you submit it. But yeah, if you've got it all cleared, it shouldn't be a problem. I mean, I love images, so I think it's nice to have that in a journal. Yeah,
certainly. And yeah, knowing that that's part of the process and thinking ahead seems really important.
Yeah.
So we have about 10 minutes within our format for today's event. If anyone has additional questions.
If not, we can have an early mark. Have you got anything else, Jacob?
That covers the terrain that I wanted to make sure that was addressed. And I should say for the group, this is the first of our professional development series for the year, right? So this will be a conversation we'll be continuing across the fall and the spring semester. So we look forward to joining the conversation as we go forward.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. And yeah, we will look forward to seeing you at the next IHR event. Cheers. Oh, of course, the Q&A blew up right as.
Okay, well,
So
good. Glad we didn't shut down.
we'll go with contingency.
Okay.
Yeah, so Eugene Clay asks, could you say something about journal ranking systems?
Oh, Eugene. Journal ranking systems are, they're a thing, okay? So universities like journals that are ranked really well. And journals are very, it's a really difficult process to get a journal ranked. Again, it depends on the editorial board. It depends on how long the journal's been around, how many people publish in it. And usually the presses then submit all that, and whether it's published on time, believe it or not. So if a journal's not published on time, then that can affect its rankings as well. So rankings are again, really important. And as somebody publishing in a journal, you want to publish in the ones that are ranked really well in that regard. And again, the way you can usually tell that is one, the quality of the editorial board and whether it's reviewed, and plus the quality of the press. So they'd be the three factors. But yes, I think also in regard to that, the better ranked the journal is, the more citations you're going to get. And universities love citations, you know. So if you're on a promotions committee or even a job committee looking for a job, people will look at your CV and go, okay, so that's in that journal. So, you know, and they'll look at your potentially your H index or even your how many times you've been cited, things like that. So the more citations you get, the better from publishing in really good quality journals, the better that is for a university, because that adds to their rankings as well. Which is why people like which is why promotion panels and job recruitment panels look at those things.
Yeah, I'm so inspired by this, because it moves us beyond just thinking about these things as just like rote statistics, which can be a fair critique of this kind of modality, but to actually sort of center us on you know, the work that we do, the way it enters the world, and the way it gets taken up, and that's what a citation ultimately is, I think is a really, really helpful way to think.
Yeah.
And then one question, what are some of the more difficult or strange situations you've seen in your years as a journal editor?
Who asked that question?
It's a Ron question.
Oh, Ron. I don't know whether it's strange, but I get a lot of emails from people just doing scattergun stuff without looking at the scopes and the aims, and sending to Derrida today a paper on molecular biology, or no kidding, right? And not even taking account that actually Derrida Today is in a science journal. So it's just, you know, that's a little weird, right? Is that people just do that without looking at the scopes and names, at which point I just press delete, really. So it's ridiculous, because it's clearly that they're actually just doing the scattergun approach to everybody, any journal in the world, right? So that's a bit weird. I don't know whether I've had too many weird things happen apart from that. I have had somebody who has supposed to do a special issue, and 2 weeks before it's due, completely dropped the ball and couldn't do the issue and hadn't done anything. So there was nothing, right? And it's 2 weeks before going to press. And because you have to actually publish in time, I basically had to ring around the editorial board and say, will you please submit an article? and can you do it in the next 2 days? And I'll have it reviewed in the next week, ready to go to press. And that was a pretty stressful situation. But that's the only time that's ever happened in 15 years of running a journal. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it was navigated, it worked out, and also intentional approaches to publishing.
Yeah.
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 Wonderful. Well, that about takes us to time. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you so much, Nicole.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.